Oh, do come in. It seems we have another little puzzle on our hands, don't we?
Murder under the kissing bough. Welcome, dear listeners, to another enchanting evening with velvet clues. I'm Connor, your devoted narrator, and tonight I have the distinct pleasure of sharing a particularly festive yet chilling tale from the village of St. Mary Mead. As always, we'll be experiencing these extraordinary events through the perceptive eyes of Miss Jane Marple, whose keen observations have unravelled more mysteries than the village has Christmas puddings. Before we begin, I wonder if you might share in the comments your favourite holiday tradition. Does your village have something as charming as a kissing bough ceremony? Now, settle in with your mulled wine or hot cocoa, and let us journey together into a Christmas that would prove most memorable indeed. Chapter 1. A festive invitation turns fatal. The December air carried the crisp promise of snow as Miss Marple carefully wound holly around the banister of her cottage, humming a gentle carol under her breath. Through her frost-etched window she could observe the village green being transformed into a winter wonderland for tomorrow evening's annual kissing bough ceremony. The tradition, dating back 3 centuries, had become St. Mary Mead's most cherished Christmas celebration, drawing visitors from neighbouring villages to witness the lighting of the enormous kissing bough suspended from the ancient oak tree. A knock at her door interrupted her decorating, revealing the cheerful face of Mrs. Bantry wrapped in a festive red scarf. "Jane, dear, you simply must attend tomorrow's ceremony. The vicar has outdone himself this year with the decorations, and I hear young Timothy Blackwood will be playing his violin." Miss Marple set down her holly with a gentle smile, noting the excitement in her friend's voice. The kissing bough ceremony had always brought out the romantic in Dolly Bantry, despite her practical nature. "I wouldn't miss it for the world, Dolly, though I must confess I'm more interested in observing the village dynamics than the mistletoe itself. Have you heard about the recent property disputes? It seems Mr. Gerald Pemberton has been quite busy with his surveys lately." Mrs. Bantry's expression darkened slightly at the mention of the property solicitor. "That dreadful man has been pestering poor Mrs. Thornbury about her cottage boundaries again. Claims her garden extends into the development land, though her family has tended that plot for generations." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened with interest behind her spectacles. "Indeed? How curious that these boundary disputes have suddenly emerged after decades of peaceful coexistence. One might almost suspect a pattern forming." As they discussed the village gossip, neither woman could have imagined that within 24 hours the festive kissing bough would become the centrepiece of a most sinister tableau. The following evening arrived with a gentle snowfall that transformed St. Mary Mead into a scene from a Christmas card. Villagers gathered on the green, their breath forming small clouds in the cold air as they admired the magnificent kissing bough. The decoration, woven from evergreen branches, holly, ivy, and countless sprigs of mistletoe, hung majestically from the oak tree's strongest branch, adorned with ribbons and small silver bells that chimed softly in the breeze. Miss Marple positioned herself near the refreshment table, where she could observe the gathering crowd while appearing to simply enjoy Mrs. Price's famous mince pies. She noticed Gerald Pemberton holding court near the tree, his expensive overcoat and pompous manner setting him apart from the village folk. He was engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with old Mr. Crawford, a retired surveyor whose weathered face showed distinct displeasure. The ceremony commenced at precisely 7 o'clock, with the vicar offering a blessing and young Timothy Blackwood beginning a haunting rendition of Silent Night on his violin. As tradition dictated, couples young and old began taking turns standing beneath the kissing bough for a festive kiss, accompanied by good-natured cheering from the crowd. It was during this cheerful chaos that the lights illuminating the bough suddenly flickered and went out. A collective gasp arose from the gathering, followed by nervous laughter as people assumed it was merely an electrical fault. But when the lights were restored moments later, the laughter died instantly. There, beneath the kissing bough, Gerald Pemberton hung suspended by a thick rope of twisted mistletoe vines wrapped around his neck, his face purple in the golden light, his expensive shoes dangling inches above the snow-dusted ground. Chapter 2. Mistletoe and Malice. The screams that erupted from the crowd pierced the winter night as effectively as any church bell might have done. Miss Marple observed with her characteristic calm as the village constable, young Tom Edmonds, pushed through the horrified onlookers to reach the grisly scene beneath the kissing bough. His face, usually ruddy with youth and good health, had turned quite pale as he attempted to establish order, while clearly fighting his own shock at the sight before him. "Everyone must step back immediately," Constable Edmonds called out, his voice cracking slightly before he recovered his composure. "This is now a crime scene. Has anyone telephoned Inspector Slack?" The vicar, trembling visibly despite his heavy coat, confirmed that the call had been made, though the inspector would need at least 30 minutes to arrive from Much Benham given the icy road conditions. Miss Marple remained at her vantage point near the refreshment table, her keen eyes taking in every detail of the macabre tableau. The mistletoe vines that suspended Gerald Pemberton had been twisted into an impressively strong rope, suggesting both premeditation and considerable strength. More interesting still was the pattern of the twisting, which showed a peculiar technique she had seen somewhere before, though she couldn't quite place where. Dr. Haydock arrived within minutes, his medical bag in hand, though it was immediately apparent that his services would not be required in any healing capacity. After a brief examination, he confirmed what everyone already knew but needed to hear officially spoken. "Death by strangulation," he announced grimly. The force required would have been considerable. This was no accident. Mrs. Bantry appeared at Miss Marple's elbow, her festive red scarf now pulled tight against the cold that seemed to have deepened since the discovery. "Jane," she whispered, "did you see anything unusual before the lights went out?" Miss Marple considered the question carefully, her mind reviewing the evening's events with methodical precision. There had been several interesting observations, though whether any proved significant remained to be determined. "I noticed Mr. Crawford arguing with Mr. Pemberton earlier," she replied quietly, "and young Sarah Mitchell from the post office seemed particularly agitated when she arrived. But then Mr. Pemberton had that effect on many people lately." "The property disputes, you mean?" Mrs. Bantry asked, though it was more statement than question. The entire village knew about Gerald Pemberton's recent activities regarding boundary surveys and property lines. As they spoke, Miss Marple observed the crowd's behaviour with interest. Most had retreated to a respectful distance, huddling in small groups and speaking in hushed tones. But a few individuals stood apart, their reactions notably different from the general shock and horror. Mr. Crawford, the retired surveyor, stood rigid near the church wall, his weathered hands clenched at his sides. His expression was difficult to read in the uncertain light, but there was something in his posture that suggested more than simple shock. Young Timothy Blackwood had abandoned his violin, the instrument hanging forgotten in his hand as he stared at the scene with wide eyes. Near him, Mrs. Thornbury wept quietly into her handkerchief, though whether from shock or some deeper emotion was impossible to determine. And there, almost hidden in the shadow of the baker's shop, stood James Morrison, the property developer who had been working closely with Pemberton on several controversial projects. The arrival of Inspector Slack brought a semblance of order to the chaos. His sharp features and businesslike manner were familiar to Miss Marple from previous investigations, and she noted with approval his immediate establishment of a proper crime scene perimeter. The kissing bough itself would need to be preserved as evidence, though how one preserved such a massive decoration was a practical challenge she didn't envy him. Constable Edmonds provided his initial report, while Inspector Slack examined the body, still suspended in its grotesque parody of the ceremony's romantic tradition. The mistletoe rope was indeed remarkable in its construction, showing a level of craftsmanship that suggested someone familiar with ropework or perhaps botanical weaving. The thickness and strength required to support a man of Pemberton's considerable weight spoke to careful planning rather than spontaneous violence. As the photographer arrived to document the scene, Miss Marple noticed something glinting in the snow beneath the body. It appeared to be a small metal object, partially buried in the fresh powder. She made a mental note to draw the inspector's attention to it when the opportunity arose, though she suspected he would discover it himself during his methodical examination. The question was whether it had fallen from Pemberton's pocket during his death throes, or if it belonged to his killer. Chapter 3. Property Lines and Deadly Lies. Inspector Slack established his temporary headquarters in the church vestry. its normally peaceful atmosphere now charged with the grim business of murder investigation. Miss Marple had been among those asked to provide statements, though she suspected the inspector valued her observations beyond the mere formality of witness testimony. The vestry's diamond-paned windows reflected the police lanterns outside, creating patterns of light that danced across the worn wooden floor as the various villagers were called in for questioning. Mr. Crawford was among the first to be interviewed, his weathered face set in lines of stubborn defiance as he entered the vestry. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner with her knitting, observed how his hands trembled slightly despite his otherwise composed demeanour. The inspector's questions were direct and probing, focusing immediately on the heated exchange witnessed between Crawford and Pemberton earlier that evening. "Yes," we argued, Crawford admitted, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "That scoundrel had been falsifying boundary surveys for months. My mother lost her cottage because of his lies, forced to sell at a fraction of its value when he claimed her garden encroached on development land." The bitterness in his voice was palpable, years of surveying experience making the falsification of records particularly galling to his professional pride. Inspector Slack leaned forward, his sharp eyes studying Crawford intently. "Your mother's cottage was sold to Morrison Developments, was it not? The same company that's been acquiring numerous properties in the village based on Pemberton's surveys?" Crawford's jaw tightened visibly. 3 weeks ago she died in a nursing home, heartbroken at losing her family home of 70 years. All because Pemberton's survey claimed she'd been illegally extending her boundaries for decades. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily as she absorbed this information. She recalled old Mrs. Crawford's cottage, a charming Tudor-style home with gardens that had won village competitions for generations. The idea that the elderly woman had somehow encroached on neighbouring land was absurd to anyone familiar with the property's long history. Yet Gerald Pemberton's official surveys had carried legal weight that mere tradition could not counter. "Where were you when the lights went out?" Inspector Slack inquired. Crawford's response was prompt and seemingly rehearsed, standing near the church door, watching the ceremony like everyone else. "Ask Mrs. Henderson, she was right beside me." The inspector made a note, though his expression suggested he would indeed be verifying this alibi thoroughly. As Crawford departed, young Sarah Mitchell was ushered in, her postal uniform replaced by a festive green dress that now seemed inappropriately cheerful given the circumstances. Her agitation from earlier had transformed into barely controlled anxiety, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap as she took the offered chair. Miss Marple noted how the girl's eyes darted repeatedly toward the door, as though contemplating escape. "Miss Mitchell," the inspector began, "you were observed in an agitated state upon arriving at the ceremony. Would you care to explain why?" Sarah's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Mr. Pemberton had been to the post office yesterday, asking questions about property deeds and old surveys. He implied that our building might be standing on land that didn't properly belong to us. My grandfather built that post office with his own hands." The pattern was becoming clearer with each interview. Gerald Pemberton had been systematically investigating property boundaries throughout the village, finding discrepancies that invariably favoured his developer associates. Whether through genuine error or deliberate falsification, his surveys had created a climate of fear and uncertainty among long-time residents, who suddenly found their ownership under question. Mrs. Thornbury's interview proved particularly poignant. The elderly woman, still dabbing at her eyes with her handkerchief, revealed that Pemberton had presented her with documents suggesting her cottage's foundation extended 6 inches onto public land, making her entire property claim potentially invalid. "He offered to help resolve the matter quietly," she explained, her voice quavering. "For a fee, of course. Or I could sell to his developer friends at their price." Inspector Slack's expression had grown increasingly grim as the interviews progressed. Each testimony painted a picture of a man who had weaponized his position of trust for personal gain, destroying lives and legacies in pursuit of profit. The question was no longer why someone might want Gerald Pemberton dead, but rather how to narrow down the extensive list of potential suspects. It was then that Constable Edmonds entered with an evidence bag containing the metal object Miss Marple had noticed in the snow. It proved to be a small surveyor's pin, the kind used to mark property boundaries during official surveys. The initials etched into its surface were barely visible but significant, R.C. Inspector Slack's eyes sharpened as he recognized the implications. "Robert Crawford," he murmured. "Our retired surveyor seems to have left us a calling card." Chapter 4. The Surveyor's Secret Knowledge. The morning following the murder dawned crisp and bright, with St. Mary Mead blanketed in fresh snow that covered all traces of the previous night's tragedy, except for the police barriers surrounding the ancient oak tree. Miss Marple, fortified by strong tea and toast, made her way to the village library where she knew certain records were kept that might prove illuminating. The librarian, Miss Weatherby, was an old friend who understood the value of discretion in delicate matters. "Jane, how dreadful about last night," Miss Weatherby whispered, though they were alone among the stacks of books and documents. "That poor Mr. Pemberton, though I must say," she paused, glancing around nervously, "he wasn't well liked. Just last week, he tried to claim the library's Victorian extension was built on land that belonged to the Morrison estate." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her fingers trailing along the spines of old surveying journals that occupied one dusty corner of the reference section. "I wondered if I might examine the historical boundary records for the village," Miss Marple said gently. "Sometimes understanding the past helps clarify the present, don't you find?" Miss Weatherby readily agreed, producing several heavy volumes bound in cracked leather, their pages yellowed with age but still legible. These contained the original surveys of St. Mary Mead, dating back 2 centuries, including detailed maps and boundary descriptions that had guided property ownership for generations. As Miss Marple studied these documents, she noticed something remarkable. The boundaries recorded in these historical surveys matched perfectly with what the villagers had always understood to be correct. The discrepancies Gerald Pemberton had been finding were not supported by any historical evidence whatsoever. More intriguingly, she discovered that Robert Crawford's father had been the village surveyor before him, creating an unbroken chain of local knowledge spanning nearly a century. Her research was interrupted by the arrival of James Morrison, the property developer who had benefited so substantially from Pemberton's controversial surveys. He was a smooth-looking man in his 50s, with the kind of polished appearance that suggested London boardrooms rather than village life. "Miss Marple," he said with forced pleasantness, "I heard you were here. Terrible business last night. I suppose everyone's trying to make sense of it all." "Indeed, Mr. Morrison," she replied, not looking up from the survey maps. "Though I find the historical records quite fascinating, it's remarkable how consistent property boundaries remained for generations until quite recently." Morrison's smile tightened perceptibly. "Old records can be misleading, Miss Marple. Modern surveying techniques often reveal errors that went unnoticed. For decades, Pemberton was simply doing his job professionally." Miss Marple finally looked up, her mild blue eyes meeting his directly. "How fortunate for your development company that these errors all seem to favour your acquisitions." Morrison's composure cracked slightly. "If you're implying something irregular about our business dealings, I must remind you that everything was entirely legal. Gerald Pemberton was a respected professional whose surveys would stand up in any court." The conversation was interrupted by Inspector Slack's arrival, his expression suggesting significant developments in the investigation. "Mr. Morrison, I'll need you to accompany me to the station for formal questioning. We've discovered some interesting documents in Pemberton's office that reference payments from your company for services beyond standard surveying fees." Morrison's face flushed, but he maintained his composure. "I'll want my solicitor present for any questioning, Inspector." After they departed, Miss Marple remained in the library, her mind working through the accumulating evidence. The surveyor's pin found at the scene clearly implicated Robert Crawford, yet something about that detail troubled her. It seemed almost too convenient, too obvious a clue for someone with Crawford's intelligence and professional experience to leave behind. Unless, of course, he had wanted it to be found. Miss Weatherby returned with another volume she'd retrieved from the archive. "This might interest you, Jane. It's Robert Crawford's personal journal from his surveying days. His family donated it to the library years ago, though I doubt anyone's looked at it since." Miss Marple accepted the journal with interest, noting Crawford's precise handwriting and meticulous attention to detail throughout its pages. One entry particularly caught her attention, dated just 6 months ago. It described his growing suspicion about discrepancies in recent property disputes, along with technical notes about various surveying methods and how they might be manipulated to produce false results. The final entry before his retirement was especially telling. The truth about boundaries isn't just in measurements, but in understanding the land's history and the stories it tells. Those who falsify these records commit crimes against heritage itself. The journal also contained pressed botanical specimens between various pages, including several varieties of mistletoe, with notes about their growth patterns and traditional uses. Crawford had apparently been something of an amateur botanist alongside his surveying work, with particular interest in how plants could indicate historical boundary lines through their growth patterns. This expertise would certainly explain the sophisticated construction of the mistletoe rope that had killed Pemberton. Chapter 5. Twisted Vines and Christmas Grief. Inspector Slack had established a more permanent investigation centre in the village hall, where the Christmassy decorations created an incongruous backdrop for the serious business of murder investigation. Miss Marple arrived for her formal statement to find the inspector studying the actual mistletoe rope that had been used to strangle Gerald Pemberton. It had been carefully preserved and laid out on a long table, its twisted vines still maintaining their deadly shape despite being removed from their victim. "The construction is quite remarkable," the inspector observed as Miss Marple took her seat. "Our forensic botanist says whoever made this understood both plant behaviour and rope-making techniques. The vines are woven in a pattern called a grapevine twist, apparently common in maritime communities, but unusual for agricultural areas." Miss Marple examined the rope with interest, her memory finally placing where she had seen such technique before. "My nephew, Raymond, once showed me something similar," she said thoughtfully. He had been sailing in Cornwall and was fascinated by the traditional rope work still practiced there. But I believe Mr. Crawford spent several years in the merchant navy as a young man, before taking up his father's surveying practice. Inspector Slack's eyes sharpened at this information. Did he indeed? That's not in his initial statement. Perhaps we should have another conversation with our retired surveyor. Before that could be arranged, however, Constable Edmonds arrived with news that sent ripples of shock through the investigation. "Sir, we found something at Crawford's cottage. You need to see this immediately." The inspector departed with urgent purpose, but not before Miss Marple caught a glimpse of what appeared to be photographs in the constable's evidence folder, images that seemed to show additional mistletoe vines being cultivated in what looked like a greenhouse setting. Left momentarily alone in the village hall, Miss Marple noticed Timothy Blackwood's violin case had been left behind from the previous night's interrupted ceremony. The young musician had been too shocked to remember it in the chaos following the discovery of Pemberton's body. Something about the case nagged at her memory, and she carefully opened it to find not only the violin but also several sheets of music, including a handwritten composition titled "Lament for Mrs. Crawford." The piece was dated just 1 week ago, shortly after the elderly woman's death in the nursing home. The musical notation was interspersed with what appeared to be personal notes, expressions of grief and anger at the injustice of her final days. Young Timothy had clearly been close to the Crawford family, closer than Miss Marple had realised. She recalled now that he had given music lessons to supplement his income, and that Mrs. Crawford had been one of his most devoted students despite her advanced age. Mrs. Bantry arrived just as Miss Marple was studying these documents, her face flushed from the cold and excitement. "Jane, you won't believe what's being said in the village. They found an entire greenhouse full of mistletoe at Robert Crawford's cottage. Dozens of vines all twisted and prepared, just like the murder weapon. And there's more." He had detailed maps of the ceremony layout, showing exactly where the kissing bough would be positioned and where the electrical connections for the lights were located. Miss Marple absorbed this information calmly, though her mind was racing through the implications. "It certainly seems damning evidence," she agreed, "though I wonder why someone as intelligent as Robert Crawford would leave such obvious proof of premeditation at his own home. Unless, of course, he wanted it to be found." "But why would anyone want to be caught for murder?" Mrs. Bantry asked, bewildered. "Sometimes, dear Dolly, confession takes many forms. Guilt can be a burden too heavy to bear alone, especially when the crime is committed in grief and anger rather than cold calculation." Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the elderly surveyor imagining his anguish at his mother's death and his fury at the man responsible for her final suffering. The carefully prepared mistletoe vines suggested weeks of planning, yet the obvious evidence left behind spoke of a man who perhaps wanted his motives understood even if it meant his own destruction. The investigation took another turn when Dr. Haydock arrived with his preliminary autopsy findings. The strangulation was indeed the cause of death, but there were additional injuries suggesting Pemberton had struggled briefly before being overpowered. Most significantly, traces of chloroform were found on his clothing, indicating he had been partially sedated before being strangled. This would have required medical knowledge or at least access to controlled substances. This detail troubled Miss Marple considerably. Robert Crawford had no medical background and chloroform wasn't something readily available to a retired surveyor. Yet someone had clearly used it to subdue Pemberton before applying the mistletoe garrote. The question was whether Crawford had an accomplice, or whether the obvious evidence pointing to him was actually an elaborate frame designed to hide the real killer's identity. The twisted vines of mistletoe seemed to mirror the twisted paths of deception that surrounded this Christmas murder. Chapter 6. The Developer's Hidden Scheme. The afternoon brought unexpected revelations when Inspector Slack returned from searching Crawford's cottage with a collection of documents that cast the entire investigation in a new light. Miss Marple was summoned to review these papers, her expertise in understanding human nature considered valuable in interpreting what had been discovered. The documents were spread across the village hall's main table, creating a paper trail of corruption that extended far beyond simple boundary disputes. "These aren't just surveys," Inspector Slack explained, his voice tight with controlled anger. Crawford had been conducting his own investigation for months, gathering evidence that Pemberton and Morrison were running an elaborate property fraud scheme. Look at these bank statements showing payments from Morrison's company to Pemberton for consultancy services that coincided exactly with each controversial boundary dispute. Miss Marple studied the meticulous records Crawford had compiled, noting his careful documentation of each falsified survey and the resulting property sales. The pattern was unmistakable and damning. Morrison Developments had systematically targeted elderly residents with valuable properties, using Pemberton's fraudulent surveys to force sales at prices far below market value. The scheme had netted millions in profits while destroying lives and family legacies throughout the village. But there was something else among Crawford's papers that particularly caught Miss Marple's attention. A series of letters between Morrison and an unknown correspondent, discussing the need to silence someone who had become a liability. The letters were dated just days before the kissing bough ceremony, and while they didn't explicitly mention murder, the language was threatening enough to suggest serious intent to harm. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe we need to reconsider Mr. Morrison's role in this affair. These letters suggest he had his own reasons for wanting Pemberton dead. Perhaps the solicitor was becoming greedy, or threatening to expose the scheme if his demands weren't met. Blackmailers often become victims themselves when they push their advantage too far." The inspector nodded grimly. Morrison's solicitor has been surprisingly evasive about his client's whereabouts during the crucial moments of the ceremony. Claims Morrison was checking on the electrical connections for the lights, which would have given him perfect opportunity to access the kissing bough unseen. But why frame Crawford? The poor man had already lost everything to their scheme. Miss Marple considered this carefully. Perhaps Crawford wasn't meant to be framed at all. The evidence at his cottage might have been planted after the murder, when it became clear the police would investigate the property fraud connection. Morrison would have known about Crawford's naval background and his mother's death, making him a perfect scapegoat. The surveyor's pin could have been stolen from Crawford's collection and deliberately dropped at the scene. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Sarah Mitchell from the post office, her face pale but determined. "Inspector, Miss Marple, I need to tell you something. I haven't been entirely truthful about that night." She paused, gathering courage. "I saw Mr. Morrison near the oak tree just before the lights went out. He was carrying something that looked like a coil of rope or vines, and he seemed to be adjusting something in the electrical box. This testimony changed everything, providing the first direct evidence of Morrison's presence at the crucial location. Inspector, Slack immediately issued orders for Morrison to be brought in for questioning. though word came back that the developer had apparently left the village that morning, claiming urgent business in London. His sudden departure only increased suspicion about his involvement in Pemberton's death. Meanwhile, Miss Marple had been examining the mistletoe rope with renewed interest. Something about its construction had continued to bother her, and she finally identified what it was. The grapevine twist was indeed sophisticated, but there were subtle variations in technique throughout its length. Some sections showed expert rope work while others were noticeably clumsier, as though two different people had worked on creating it. "Dolly," she said to Mrs. Bantry, who had been observing quietly, "I believe we may be dealing with more than one killer. This rope shows two distinct styles of construction. Someone with naval experience created the basic structure, but another person, less skilled, added to it. The question is whether they work together intentionally, or whether one person's preparation was co-opted by another." The investigation took another dramatic turn when Timothy Blackwood arrived at the village hall, his young face etched with distress. "I need to confess something," he announced to the startled assembly. "I helped Mr. Crawford prepare those mistletoe vines. He asked me to assist him weeks ago, said he needed them for a special Christmas decoration to honour his mother's memory. I had no idea what he truly intended. I swear it." This admission created a sensation, but Miss Marple noticed something crucial in the young man's demeanour. While clearly upset, he didn't show the deep guilt she would expect from someone who had unknowingly aided in murder preparation. There was something else behind his confession, a protective instinct perhaps, aimed at shielding someone else from suspicion. Chapter 7. Footprints in the December snow. The fresh snowfall from that morning had preserved something the initial investigation had missed, a discovery made by young Tommy Henderson while building a snowman near the ancient oak tree. The boys' excited shouts brought Constable Edmonds running, and within minutes Inspector Slack was examining a set of footprints that had been protected from the overnight snow by the oak tree's massive trunk. These prints told a story that contradicted much of what they thought they knew about the murder. "There are 3 distinct sets of footprints here," Inspector Slack announced, his breath forming clouds in the cold air as he knelt beside the preserved impressions. "One set clearly belongs to Pemberton, based on the expensive shoe pattern. The second appears to be from work boots, size 10, with a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel. But this third set, these are from ladies' boots, quite small, with a decorative heel." Miss Marple studied the prints with great interest, noting how they overlapped and intersected in a way that suggested a complex interaction rather than a simple attack. The ladies' prints approached from the direction of the church, while the work boots came from behind the baker's shop, where the electrical controls were housed. Most tellingly, both sets converged on Pemberton's position at approximately the same time, then diverged sharply after what must have been the moment of attack. The work boots headed toward the cottages on Chapel Lane, she observed, where Mr. Crawford lives. But these ladies' prints go in an entirely different direction, toward the new development where Morrison's office is located. How very curious that our killer, or killers, should separate so definitively after the crime. Inspector Slack had already dispatched constables to search for matching footwear, but Miss Marple had her own suspicions about the owner of those ladies' boots. She recalled seeing someone at the ceremony wearing distinctive heeled boots with decorative buckles, someone who had stood in Morrison's shadow throughout the evening, and whose presence had been so unremarkable that no one had thought to question her movements. Mrs. Bantry arrived with disturbing news from the village telegraph office. James Morrison had been arrested attempting to board a ship at Dover, carrying a substantial amount of cash and documents that appeared to be forged property deeds for developments across 3 counties. His secretary, Miss Patricia Thornton, had also disappeared, though her lodgings showed signs of hasty packing rather than planned departure. Patricia Thornton, Miss Marple mused aloud. Morrison's secretary, who always wore those fashionable boots with the decorative heels. I remember now, she was standing near the electrical controls just before the lights went out, supposedly checking on Morrison's behalf. But what connection could she have to Pemberton's death beyond her employer's schemes? The answer came from an unexpected source when Dr. Haydock arrived with additional forensic findings. The chloroform traces on Pemberton's clothing showed a particular pattern of application, suggesting someone had approached from behind and held a soaked cloth over his face. The angle and pressure points indicated someone significantly shorter than Pemberton, consistent with a woman of average height rather than a man. Furthermore, the doctor continued, we found traces of expensive perfume on the mistletoe rope, specifically near the sections that show less skilled construction. It's a French scent, quite distinctive, called Nuit de Noël. Not something commonly worn in St. Mary Mead, I can assure you. Miss Marple's memory immediately supplied an image of Patricia Thornton at various village events, always impeccably dressed and wearing a cloud of that exact perfume. The pieces were falling into place, revealing a more complex murder plot than anyone had initially suspected. Inspector Slack organised his evidence with growing excitement as the true picture emerged. So, Crawford prepared the mistletoe rope, intending to use it himself for revenge against Pemberton. But someone else got there first, someone who had their own reasons for wanting the solicitor dead. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. I suspect Miss Thornton discovered Crawford's preparations, perhaps while snooping on Morrison's behalf, and decided to use them for her own purposes. She had access to chloroform through Morrison's various business connections, and she certainly had motive if Pemberton was becoming a liability to their scheme. But would she have acted alone, or was Morrison himself involved? The question was partially answered when Timothy Blackwood returned with additional information. He had remembered something crucial about the evening of the ceremony. He had seen Miss Thornton near Crawford's greenhouse a week before the murder, examining the twisted mistletoe vines the old surveyor had been preparing. She had seemed fascinated by them, even taking photographs with her camera. She must have realized what Crawford intended, Inspector Slack concluded, then decided to use his plan as cover for her own crime, knowing he would be the obvious suspect. The dropped surveyor's pin was probably her addition, stolen from Crawford's collection to strengthen the frame. But something went wrong with her plan. Perhaps Morrison's sudden decision to flee forced her to act hastily. Chapter 8. The Secretary's Desperate Gambit. Patricia Thornton was apprehended at Victoria Station attempting to board a train to Portsmouth with a ticket purchased under a false name. When brought back to St. Mary Mead for questioning, she presented a remarkable contrast to the composed, elegant secretary who had been Morrison's shadow for the past 2 years. Her usually perfect appearance was dishevelled, her expensive coat mud-stained, and her carefully styled hair had come undone, revealing grey roots beneath the artificial auburn colour. Inspector Slack conducted the interrogation in the village hall with Miss Marple present as an observer, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she watched the young woman's facade crumble under sustained questioning. Patricia's initial attempts at denial quickly gave way to a desperate need to justify her actions, revealing a story more complex than anyone had anticipated. "You don't understand," Patricia said, her cultured accent slipping occasionally to reveal traces of a rougher origin. Gerald Pemberton wasn't just falsifying surveys for Morrison's benefit. He had discovered something about my past, something that would have destroyed everything I'd built. He was blackmailing me separately from his arrangement with Morrison, threatening to reveal that I had served time for embezzlement 5 years ago under my real name, Patricia Hartley. Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily as she absorbed this information. So, Mr. Pemberton was playing multiple games simultaneously, she observed, defrauding villagers with Morrison while secretly blackmailing you with information that would have ended your carefully constructed new identity. A dangerous game indeed. Patricia's laugh was bitter and without humour. Morrison never knew about my past. He thought he'd found the perfect secretary, someone intelligent and discreet who could handle the questionable aspects of his business without qualms. But Pemberton recognised me from a photograph in an old newspaper. He'd been bleeding me dry for months, taking almost everything I earned while threatening to expose me if I didn't continue paying. The interrogation revealed layer upon layer of deception. Patricia had indeed discovered Crawford's plan to murder Pemberton, having followed the old surveyor one evening when she noticed him behaving suspiciously near the greenhouse. She had watched him prepare the mistletoe garrote and heard him muttering about revenge for his mother's death. The opportunity had seemed heaven-sent, a chance to eliminate her blackmailer while letting someone else take the blame. But I wasn't going to let Crawford actually do it, she insisted, though her protest rang hollow. I thought if I got there first, used his weapon but made it look different somehow, the police would be confused enough that no one would be convicted. Crawford would be suspected but not proven guilty, and I would be free of Pemberton forever. I even used chloroform to make it seem more professional, less like something a grief-stricken old man would do. Inspector Slack leaned forward intently. And Morrison? What was his involvement in the murder? Patricia's expression hardened. James Morrison is many things, a fraud, a thief, and a destroyer of lives, but he's not a killer. He was genuinely checking the electrical systems when Pemberton died. I made sure of that, sending him to investigate a supposed problem with the connections that I had reported earlier. He had the perfect alibi because I created it for him. Miss Marple found this revelation particularly interesting. Patricia had protected the man she worked for even while planning a murder that could have destroyed his business empire. It suggested a complex emotional connection that went beyond mere employment. When questioned about this, Patricia's composure finally shattered completely, tears streaming down her face as the truth emerged. I loved him, she admitted through her sobs. James Morrison never saw me as anything more than an efficient secretary, but I loved him desperately. Everything I did was to protect him, to be invaluable to him. When Pemberton threatened to expose my past, it wasn't just my position I feared losing, it was my proximity to James. I couldn't bear the thought of him looking at me with disgust when he learned about my criminal history. The tragic irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Patricia had committed murder to preserve a relationship that existed only in her imagination, destroying multiple lives in pursuit of a love that was never returned, or even recognized. Morrison himself, when brought in for questioning about the property fraud, seemed genuinely shocked to learn of his secretary's feelings and her crimes on his supposed behalf. As Patricia was formally charged with murder, Miss Marple reflected on the cascading series of deceptions that had led to this moment. Pemberton's fraudulent surveys had created the initial injustice. Crawford's planned revenge had provided the weapon. Morrison's schemes had created the environment of corruption, and Patricia's desperate love and fear had provided the final catalyst for murder. The kissing bough, meant to symbolize love and celebration, had instead become the stage for a tragedy born of greed, blackmail, and unrequited affection. Chapter 9. The Truth Beneath the Kissing Bough. Robert Crawford sat in the village hall, his weathered hands folded calmly in his lap as he listened to Inspector Slack explain how Patricia Thornton had confessed to the murder. The old surveyor's expression was difficult to read, showing neither relief at his apparent exoneration nor surprise at the revelation of the true killer. Miss Marple observed him carefully, noting the way his jaw tightened when Pemberton's name was mentioned, and how his fingers unconsciously traced patterns that resembled the grapevine twist of the mistletoe rope. "So you're telling me," Crawford said slowly, "that this secretary woman used the weapon I prepared to kill the man I intended to kill, and she did it for completely different reasons than mine?" The irony seemed to weigh heavily upon him, though whether it brought satisfaction or disappointment was unclear. Inspector Slack nodded, studying the old man's reaction closely. "Your preparation of the weapon still constitutes conspiracy to commit murder, Mr. Crawford, even if someone else ultimately used it." Crawford's laugh was dry and humorless. "Conspiracy? Inspector, I spent 6 weeks preparing that garrote, learning the exact timing of the ceremony, studying the electrical systems, planning every detail of how I would avenge my mother's death. And then someone else beat me to it. Perhaps there's some cosmic justice in that, being denied even the satisfaction of revenge." Miss Marple spoke gently but firmly. "Mr. Crawford, I believe there's more to your story than simple revenge. Your journal shows you had been investigating Pemberton and Morrison's scheme for months before your mother's death. You were trying to expose them legally, weren't you? It was only after your mother died that you turned to thoughts of murder." The old surveyor's composure finally cracked, tears flowing down his weathered cheeks. She died believing she had done something wrong, that she had somehow stolen land that wasn't hers. The shame of it broke her heart faster than age ever could. I showed her my research, proved that Pemberton's surveys were fraudulent, but by then the damage was done. She died thinking the whole village believed her to be a thief. Dr. Haydock, who had been called to examine Crawford given his emotional state, provided an unexpected piece of information. "Mr. Crawford came to me 3 weeks ago, complaining of chest pains and shortness of breath. My examination revealed advanced heart disease. He likely has less than 6 months to live, possibly much less given the stress of recent events. This revelation cast Crawford's murder plan in a different light entirely. He had been a man with nothing left to lose, willing to trade his remaining months for what he saw as justice for his mother. The elaborate preparation hadn't just been about ensuring success, but about leaving behind a clear message about why Pemberton had to die. The mistletoe rope itself was symbolic, representing the parasitic nature of Pemberton's relationship with the village. Patricia Thornton's statement was read aloud, revealing additional details about that fatal night. She had followed Crawford to the ceremony, watching him position himself near his prepared weapon. But when the moment came for him to act, the old surveyor had hesitated, his hand on his chest as though in pain. Patricia had seized the opportunity, using the chloroform to subdue Pemberton, while Crawford was incapacitated by what was likely a mild cardiac episode. "I couldn't do it," Crawford admitted quietly. "When the moment came, when I saw him standing there under the kissing bough, I couldn't become a killer. My mother would have been ashamed of me. But then the lights went out, and when they came back on, he was dead anyway. I thought perhaps I had done it and forgotten, some kind of blackout from my heart condition. It was only when the police found the chloroform that I knew someone else had been involved." Inspector Slack faced a complex legal situation. Crawford had conspired to commit murder and prepared the weapon, but Patricia Thornton had independently committed the actual crime using his preparations. The property fraud scheme that had motivated Crawford was real and criminal, though Morrison claimed Pemberton had acted alone in falsifying the surveys. The web of crimes and motivations was so tangled that determining appropriate charges for each party would challenge the legal system for months to come. Miss Marple had one final question for Crawford. "The surveyor's pin found at the scene. Did you drop it deliberately?" Crawford shook his head. "That pin went missing from my collection weeks ago. I suspected someone had been in my greenhouse, examining my preparations. Now I know it was Patricia. She must have taken it then to use as false evidence, though I suppose I should thank her for that small mercy, making the frame so obvious that it actually helped prove my innocence of the actual murder." As Crawford was led away to be formally charged with conspiracy, Miss Marple reflected on the tragedy of the entire affair. Multiple lives had been destroyed by greed and deception, with Pemberton's fraudulent surveys setting in motion a chain of events that led inevitably to murder. The kissing bough ceremony, which should have marked the beginning of Christmas celebrations, would forever be tainted by the memory of death beneath its branches. Chapter 10. Christmas Morning's Cold Resolution. Christmas morning arrived in St. Mary Mead with a pristine blanket of snow and church bells ringing across the frozen air. Miss Marple sat in her cottage, looking out at the village green where the ancient oak stood bare of its fatal decoration. The kissing bough had been removed as evidence, and the vicar had decided against replacing it, feeling the tradition had been too thoroughly tainted by recent events. Perhaps in future years the village might reclaim the custom, but not this Christmas. Connor here again, dear listeners, as we prepare to conclude this chilling tale of Yuletide murder. Before we hear Miss Marple's final observations, I want to thank you for joining us through this journey into the dark heart that can hide beneath festive celebrations. The truth, as our dear detective has shown us, often lies not in what we see, but in understanding why people act as they do. Mrs. Bantry arrived for Christmas tea, bringing with her the latest news from the legal proceedings. Patricia Thornton had been charged with murder and would likely face life imprisonment. Her desperate attempt to preserve a fantasy had cost her everything she had worked to build. James Morrison faced multiple fraud charges that would probably result in several years' imprisonment and the complete dissolution of his development empire. His corruption of Gerald Pemberton had created the circumstances that led to murder, making him morally if not legally responsible for the death. Robert Crawford's situation was more complex. His confession to conspiracy to commit murder would normally carry a severe sentence, but his terminal illness and the circumstances of his mother's death had generated considerable sympathy. The judge had indicated that given Crawford's condition and the fact he had ultimately not committed the murder, a suspended sentence might be appropriate, allowing the old surveyor to die peacefully in his own home rather than in prison. What troubles me most, Mrs. Bantry said, settling into her chair with her tea, is how Pemberton's greed poisoned everything it touched. Those falsified surveys didn't just steal property, they destroyed trust, broke hearts, and ultimately led to murder. The damage rippled outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her keen eyes reflecting the winter sunlight that streamed through her window. Indeed, Dolly. Mr. Pemberton believed himself clever, manipulating boundaries and documents for profit, but he failed to recognize that when you destroy people's security and heritage, you create a desperation that can drive even good people to contemplate terrible acts. Mr. Crawford spent his entire career maintaining accurate records and preserving the village's historical boundaries. To see that work perverted for greed must have been agonizing even before his mother's tragedy. The village itself had begun to heal, though slowly. The false surveys had been officially invalidated, and properties wrongfully taken were being returned to their rightful owners where possible. Crawford's meticulous counter-investigation had provided the evidence needed to untangle Morrison and Pemberton's web of deception. In an ironic twist, the old surveyor's dedication to truth had ultimately achieved justice through legal means, even though he had been prepared to pursue it through murder. Young Timothy Blackwood had been deeply affected by the events, his innocence in helping Crawford prepare the mistletoe vines without understanding their purpose weighing heavily on his conscience. Miss Marple had made a point of speaking with him, assuring him that his kindness to a grieving old man wasn't something to be ashamed of, even though it had been exploited for dark purposes. The young musician had composed a new piece, a requiem for all those destroyed by greed, which he planned to perform at a memorial concert for Mrs. Crawford. Inspector Slack visited Miss Marple one final time before closing the official investigation. "Miss Marple, your observations were invaluable as always, though I must say, this case was particularly complex with its multiple conspiracies and overlapping motivations. How do you manage to see through such elaborate deceptions?" he asked with genuine curiosity. Miss Marple smiled gently, pouring fresh tea for the inspector. "People are remarkably consistent in their behaviours, Inspector. Patricia Thornton acted from desperate love and fear, exactly as one might expect from someone with her history of taking desperate measures when cornered. Mr. Crawford acted from grief and a desire for justice, modified by his fundamental decency when the crucial moment arrived. Even poor Mr. Pemberton acted predictably, pushing his blackmail and fraud until he pushed someone too far. Understanding human nature, really understanding it, makes most mysteries quite transparent." As Inspector Slack departed, and the short winter day drew to a close, Miss Marple stood at her window watching the village prepare for Christmas evening services. The church bells rang out across the snow-covered landscape, calling the faithful to worship. Despite the tragedy that had marked the season's beginning, life continued its eternal rhythm. Children built snowmen where a murder had been discovered, carols were sung in the same square where death had struck, and the village endured as it had for centuries. Thank you for joining us for this Christmas mystery, dear listeners. Miss Marple's wisdom reminds us that even in the darkest moments, truth and justice will prevail. Until next time, this is Connor from Velvet Clues, wishing you peaceful nights and mysteries that remain safely within the pages of books.